Happy Thursday evening, everyone. It's going to be an interesting night tonight. Going to have some familiar scenes, but we're going to have some, unfamiliar conversations about these scenes, things that we aren't normally taught about when we're young. We get the pictures, we get the coloring pages and whatnot, but when we look through this, it's typically a superficial reading, and I want to dig a little bit deeper tonight, cover some of this stuff. So I hope you guys are interested. Stick with me for the ride. We're going to cover Exodus 3 and 4 tonight. So welcome aboard. Hey, Missy. Hey, Mom. As always, I'm reading out of the King James. Have the ESV up for some modern English, and I'm going to touch on that tonight. Actually, I'm going to talk about the ESV, the way that it's presented, because the ESV, I think, gets it wrong here. The way that it presents it, the way that it kind of cuts it off, or whatever. The paragraphing that's not in the King James. The King James is just verse by verse. But the paragraphing and the topical references they do, I think, is somewhat based on interpretation. I think the ESV, like so many of the modern translations, gets it wrong. And we'll talk about that tonight. And then we've got a little bit of the original Hebrew that we're going to talk about as well, because it's important for what God tells Moses. Rosalind, Tom, Tracy, welcome aboard. And we'll give a minute or so for everyone to get on. I got a little bit of a late start tonight. Had some last minute questions to address. And of course, I've got a little bit up here with me. So if she has a sudden need, I'll probably have to address that. But usually she's pretty good. And she's fed. I'll tell you what, she has found an almost addiction to lentil soup. We get the Amy soup, and it's a really tasty lentil soup. And she gets a hold of that. She'll eat 2 cans at a time. She just loves it. It's really, and it's very healthy for her, so I don't mind. But we gave her some lentil soup tonight, and so she should be happy. Took care of other needs before we got started, so we should be okay. But anyway, so tonight let's get into the burning bush. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. Hey, Stephen, welcome aboard. Glad you're here tonight. It says, Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. So he's at Mount Horeb. And one of the things that might be brought up, it's probably, it's one I've heard once or twice in my time doing a lot of apologetics type stuff online, arguing with strangers pointlessly. Well, I don't say pointlessly, because it sharpened me to do that. A lot of the times when you get on and you discuss things, debate things with people that probably you're not going to be convinced because they're set to believe what they could believe, you still are going to learn things and grow yourself. So it's not pointless, but very few were convinced. But they brought up the idea that in Exodus 3, Moses calls his father-in-law Jethro. And in Exodus 2, his father-in-law is called Reuel. And those are 2 different names, have 2 different meanings. And they argue, there's a contradiction in the Bible. You have, which one is it? Is it Jethro or Reuel? And the answer is real easy. We look back to Jacob, and how many names did Jacob have? Jacob had his birth name, and then he also had a given name, Israel. In fact, if you keep reading through the Old Testament, you'll find that he actually had several names. It wasn't just those 2. There was quite a few names that Jethro had. But it's not a conflict. People in these days, remember, names had meaning. We don't typically name our children based on the meanings of their names. We name them because of the way they sound, or maybe because that's a relative's name. Or I know I have a brother, if I remember correctly, who's named after a a character in a movie that my parents were watching at one time, and they like the name. Mom can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but we don't name our kids based on what meanings we want them to have in their life. We could look at like Stephen's name. Stephen Stephanos is crown. And we've kind of been joking about that because of the coronavirus, which corona also means crown. It also happens to be the name of the town that Rapunzel and Flynn Rider are. That kingdom was the kingdom of Corona. And, there's all kinds of things. You can get into the meanings of those words, but sometimes the names are just there. But back in this time, right, yeah, but that's the argument, and sometimes these guys are younger. They're not like, not every argument I had was with a Richard Dawkins level person. Sometimes it's just another college kid that was on some college forum, and they were kind of getting their feet wet in the whole debate arena as well. And so they've never heard the counters to these arguments yet, and it occurs to them. They don't fully understand what a contradiction actually is, and so you address it, and they at least learned that if they didn't come to agree with you fully on anything. But yeah, Jethro, Reuel, it's fine that he had multiple names. They did back then, and that's not a contradiction or a complication of any kind. Super easy to answer that. So I thought I'd touch on it just because I had heard it before. So anyway, Moses goes up to this mountain, Mount Horeb, and says in verse 2, "And the angel of Jehovah appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush." So who is in the bush? It's the angel of Jehovah. All right, so keep that in mind, because we've brought this up, and it comes up a lot. It comes up a lot more than is trivial. Yeah, no mercy. And so I want you to pay attention, because this is an important point to make, and I think it's an important point central to the Old Testament to really understand what's going on here and who's who. So it says, "The angel of Jehovah appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed." Hey, John, welcome aboard. "And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when Jehovah saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush." So, who's in the bush? Well, it's the angel of Jehovah. Who's calling to him out of the bush, out of the midst of the bush? Well, it's God. So again, over and over again, we're seeing this example where the angel of Jehovah is interchangeable with God himself. And so again, my argument is that this particular, the angel, not an angel, not a messenger, but the messenger of Jehovah. It's a specific singular entity here over and over again is God. It's the theophany. It's God the Son. And so And the other point to make here is that when the Jehovah's Witnesses make their argument that Jesus is Michael the Archangel, and so he can't be God, the problem that they face is that the angel of Jehovah is identified as God over and over again, and that's actually one of the arguments that they have to make to say that this is Jesus, that this is Jesus before he becomes man, before he is born of Mary. Is that they have to show over and over again that the angel of Jehovah is identified as God. And when they do that, they are admitting that Jesus is God. And so their arguments confuse me sometimes. I don't understand how they can see any kind of consistency in them. But anyway, it's very clear here to me that this is the angel of Jehovah who has appeared in the bush, and it is God speaking to him from out of the bush, and they are the same person. So again, verse 4, "And when Jehovah saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I." And again, we see this phrase used by so many of the faithful, and as Brian had given to us the first time, "Here am I" is a phrase in the Hebrew that is, "I'm ready." I'm here, I'm ready to serve, I'm ready to go, ready to act. So it's a fairly forceful verse or a phrase for them to use. And he said, "Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." And so Moses is going to come, and of course there's a big tradition of foot washing, and when people are traveling, their feet are dirty, and you've got a little bit of, I think, that tradition in this. And here God is saying, take off those old nasty sandals, because you're going to be on holy ground. And there's this idea of purity that is going to start here. And we're going to see this idea of purity and purification moving forward. So he says, you're standing on holy ground. And then he says in verse 6, "Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And Jehovah said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." Now, again, this is an interesting verse to me. And like I said, we're going to dig a little bit deeper, because this verse indicates that this is still a relatively new thing. I talked last time about the idea that it was really just about one generation, about a little bit over 40 years, where Joseph and his brothers, that generation had passed away, and Joseph had lived to see his great-grandchild, and it's that generation, the great-grandchild. And then I talked also about the fact that you had Levi bore Kohath, and Kohath had Amram, and Amram had Moses. So again, we're talking about fourth generation here. And so this idea of the enslavement is a new thing. It's a recent thing where God didn't just let them sit and stew in slavery for generations. It's a thing where, okay, the Egyptian regime changes, they put them into slavery. Moses has to kind of be prepared a little bit, cooked a little bit as the prince of Egypt, and then God tells Moses when God knows that Moses is ready, he says, "You need to go in and you need to free my people. I've heard them calling out." And so this is that time period that's passed, and I think this is an indication of that God does things in his time, but he did not let them suffer in slavery for a long time, as maybe some of us have been kind of taught innocently. But I think if you dig a little bit deeper, I don't think it was as long a time. It definitely was not hundreds of years, 450 years or something like that. It's definitely just a little a little short space of time, mostly I would say over the course of Moses's early and middle life, not anything beyond that. Hey Spencer, welcome aboard. All right, so verse 8, "And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites." Okay, so here's an interesting thing. Hey Kimberly, glad to have you here. God says, "I am come down." Now that's an important phrase, because there's a lot of times when God says, "I am coming." He says it a lot in the books of prophecy. We're going to see it in the New Testament. There's a lot of talk of the coming of the Lord and the day of the Lord and all of that. Those are almost always a coming and judgment against some wicked nation. Particularly later on, it's actually a lot of times referring to wicked Israel for persecuting the church. But here, God has come down, God has come, and he's going to render judgment against Egypt because before they had been a good nation. They had been friends of Joseph and friends of Joseph's family, and then they got a new regime in there and it turned wicked. And so has come to punish them. And so that phrase, pay attention to that phrase. You're going to see it a lot as we continue through the Bible and study these things. So, and then he says, I'm going to bring your people up out of Egypt. I'm going to bring them to the land of Canaan and all of these nations, and they're going to be driven out for their own wickedness. Oh my goodness, my throat is so dry. Spent a lot of time outside playing archery today, so I'm a little dry. That's better. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so here's the sending of in the hero's journey. Those of us who are authors will recognize this. This is the call, the hero's call, and of course now we got the denial of the call. Moses said unto God, "Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And Moses, why are you picking me, God? Who am I? He's looking back. He's Prince of Egypt. They're not gonna like. They already have expressed they don't like him because of that. Right before he fled, he is now been out here tending sheep and stuff, disassociated from his people, and so he's like, "Why are you sending me? Who am I to go and bring these people?" And he said, "Certainly I will be with thee. And this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain." So God is saying, I'm going to be with you, and to show you that what I'm saying is true, you're going to end up coming right back to this mountain and worshiping all of the whole Israelite nation is going to come back to this mountain. You're going to worship at this mountain. So Moses said unto God, "Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them?" So we're in a time period where there's a whole lot of gods that have been invented. We talk about this with Laban. For thus the Lord has spoken to me, as a lion roars and a young lion over his prey. When a multitude of shepherds is summoned against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor be disturbed by their noise. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight for Mount Zion and for its hill. That's Isaiah 31:4. Yeah, that's another example. And you got another good one is Isaiah 19. If you look in Isaiah 19, it's actually that the Lord's going to come on a swift cloud to Egypt. And again, that's a chapter of bringing judgment. But anyway, this is a time period where there's a lot of deities, a lot of different names. Of course, Egypt has its own deities. There's a whole host of them that they had. And so when Moses comes back, his people are going to be skeptical. Moses is going to claim that some God is going to rescue the people out of Egypt. And so they're going to be like, okay, yeah, which God are you talking about? And for the most part, I think that Moses has the right of it, that they are right to ask, because if it's anybody but Jehovah has no power, because they're all fake gods. They're stone and wood, and they have no real power. And the Hebrew people know this. And so they are right to ask, which God are you claiming is going to get us out of here? Because we don't get in more trouble with the Egyptians than we're already in. And so Jehovah says, verse 14, "And God said unto Moses, I am that I am." And in Hebrew, that's Hayah. And if you look at the name Jehovah is taken from that root. God's name literally means the self-existent one. And when I get into some of my apologetics type stuff, and we talk about where did the universe come from, how did the universe get here? Well, there's only three options. The universe either has always been here, which ends up violating the second law of thermodynamics. The universe created itself out of nothing, which violates the first law of thermodynamics. Which, if you're talking purely naturalistic origins, as the atheists do, then you can't violate laws. And so that leaves the only possible third option, which is something exterior to and superior to the universe made it. Well, if you have anything that is itself something that has to obey laws, you run into the same problem. How did that get there? How did that get there? And you keep going back infinitely, and you run into something called the law of infinites, which says if you have anything that's infinite, you've already reached what is effectively the end of that. We would already have died a heat death. There's no way that we could exist in the state that we do now. However, if you look at a mind, an exterior superior mind, what we would call eternal, then that mind can exist outside of the laws, because that mind is the lawgiver. And if you have a lawgiver that exists eternally, then that mind does not have to have a beginning, and it does not have to have obedience to all of these natural laws. Of course, this mind is also supernatural. That's the definition of supernatural, is above these laws. And so for God to say, I am, for his name to be Jehovah, he's literally saying, I am the eternally existent one. He's identifying himself as the first cause, the uncaused cause. And if the Bible had been written by man, this would not have been a meaningful name. When you look at all of the names of all of the deities that are brought up, that are created by man, their names are names that man would like. When you talk about Zeus or Jupiter, or you talk about Aphrodite or Hephaestus, or when you talk about Set and all of the huge different Ashtoreth, all of these names are names that man thinks is cool, and I want a god that's like that. They're not thinking about these mind-blowingly universal concepts that we, who are more scientifically minded, ask these big questions. Where do we come from? And so for God to say that my name is the eternally existent one, that is one of the evidences that the Bible is true, and that God is the creator of it, the creator of the universe, for me, it's just a puzzle piece that fits so well as evidence for the truth of the Bible, the truth for the existence of God, and all of the things that I have essentially been arguing for my entire life. Well, at least since I was a kid, since I was about 14 is where I put that. So I just love this verse here. I am that I am, and I love the connection it has to the name Jehovah as the eternally existent one. So anyway, God said unto Moses, I am that I am, and he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, Jehovah God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. So not only does he identify himself by his name, Jehovah, or I am, Hayah, he identifies himself by his relationship to their progenitors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the God. Moses is supposed to tell him, that's the God that sent me, is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Hebrew will hear that, and they'll be like, okay, we know that God, and we know that God is capable of doing things. And so they will listen, and they will believe. And brings up again another point. I think I've made this point in the past. What is the name of God? The name of God is Jehovah. If I say God did this and God did that, one of the things that I joke with my students in class about it, but I'm also trying to teach a little bit of a lesson, is some kid will say, like, God, this test is hard, or something like that, and they're being flippant with their use of the word God, and I'll say, hey, no references to Thor in my classroom, and they'll look at me funny, and I'll say, wait, did you mean a different God? And the point I'm trying to make is that the word God is reference to the type of being. It is not his name. When we say God, we can say false gods. We can say the one true and living God. God did not identify himself to Moses as God. He didn't say El sent you or Elohim sent you. He said Hayah sent you. Jehovah sent you. And so that's his name. And so when somebody says, oh my God, or something like that, and then somebody else misunderstanding says, you can't use the name of God in vain. Well, they didn't. Not saying that they should flippantly talk about deity like that, but it's not a technically correct understanding. When God says, thou shalt not use the name of thy Lord God in vain, thou shalt not use the name of Jehovah God in vain, what he's really saying is, do not try to say that something is from God, particularly commands. And we can go into the New Testament and talk about the Pharisees. When they say that God said to do it this way, when they teach for doctrine the commandments of men, when they say, hey, this is from God, and God didn't say that, that's when they're using the name of God in vain. They're trying to draw on his authority for their pet little beliefs or commands. So anytime anybody says, like, we can use an example of worship. The Bible is very clear in the New Testament on how we're to worship God. There's specific things that God says to do to worship God. And any additions to that, the Bible, again, is very clear. Don't corrupt the gospel. Galatians chapter 1. Don't add to or take away from what's been written. Revelation 22, 18 and 19. We see it here in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 4:2. Don't add to or take away from the scriptures. Leviticus 10. Nadab and Abihu did something that God had not commanded them. God didn't say no. God didn't give us a list of all the things he didn't want us to do. There are some things, but for the most part, God said, you do this. This is what I want you to do. And then he eliminated everything else. And when man comes behind God and says that this is okay to do, or that this is appropriate or authorized by God, that God said it's okay, or I believe that God would be okay with this, that's what it means to use the name of Jehovah in vain. You are saying something is authorized by our Creator who knows us better, and it's not. And that's Matthew 15:9, and then Matthew 15 a little bit later on talks about every plant that my Heavenly Father has not planted is going to be rooted up and cast into the fire. That is what it looks like to use the name of Jehovah in vain. It's not so much this idea of flippant usage. That's probably a small part of it, but again, it would have to be his name, not his being. If you came up and called me human, I might turn around and look at you because I happen to be a human, but that's not my name. My name is not human. My name is Ernie. And so God's name is not God. God's name is Jehovah, the self-existent one. All right. So continuing on here, verse 17, and I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. Those Hittites are pretty cool because that's one of those nations where a lot of people were like, yeah, the Bible talks about it, but we don't have any archaeological proof that that nation ever existed, and the Bible's just making up people. And then later on, we discovered, it wasn't too long ago, that we discovered ruins that were the Hittite people, and it proved the Bible once again to be true. Now, I've long since left behind any doubt about the truth or veracity of Scripture, but for other people who, you can present, hey, these were the arguments that were being made early 20th century, that the Hittites were just made up and the Bible is kind of fake. And then, boom, here comes the archaeology, proves the Hittites were true and real. And it kind of blows them away a little bit. Wow, these things that nobody knew about for hundreds and hundreds of years, because the Hittite nation is wiped out, is scattered, is driven out of the land, and there anything left of them. When God finishes a people, He's finished a people. And so, whatever the Israelites didn't actually kill in their prosecution of war against them, they were all scattered throughout the land and were no longer a people, a nation anymore. They got absorbed into other nations. So, just a little cool little thing about the Hittites there, and how archaeology backs up the Bible. So, all right, verse 18, and they shall hearken to thy voice, and thou shalt come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt. And you shall say unto him, Jehovah God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to Jehovah our God. So this wilderness is not, as the map sometimes put, that little kind of triangular thing where it's really close and then you have two rivers kind of bordering it. A lot of people say that little thing there is the wilderness. The wilderness that Moses is talking about is essentially Saudi Arabia. And so Moses is asking to go a pretty good ways into that wilderness, but they would have to travel to get there first, and then 3 more days into the wilderness. So he would be moving the Israelite people, the whole of the Israelite people, pretty far away from Egypt. And that's basically what he's asking, what God is telling Moses to ask Pharaoh to do. So, and verse 19, and I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. So God says, make this request, but I know Pharaoh's not gonna accept it. And I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. So God says, Pharaoh's going to say no, and then I'm going to show all my wonders. So that means that God's going to do all of the plagues. And Pharaoh's going to keep saying no until God's done with all 10 of them. 10 is a number of completion. Throughout the Bible, we see this idea of 10 being a number of completion. You can see it in terms of 1,000 sometimes, where you have divine completion. 3 times 10, 3 is heaven or divine, and so 3 times 10 is, or not 3 times 10, but 10 times 10 times 10, 10 3 times is 1,000, which is divine completion. But this idea of 10 plagues is the completeness of all the plagues. God knew He was going to be doing 10 plagues, is what I'm saying here, and so He says after that He will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And so, remember, this is a hard thing, and this is just a recent thing that I'm exploring. I don't know that this is true, but this is the idea that I get from reading this. The Egyptian people were saved by Joseph. While everybody else was dying off because of this famine and becoming weak, the Egyptian people actually had their very lives saved by Joseph, who was a Hebrew, and they will have known of him if they didn't know him personally. And so it's this new Pharaoh that's setting taskmasters over the Hebrew people. He's the one that's treating the Hebrews bad. And for their part, the Egyptian people may not necessarily be evil or treating the Hebrews bad. And here it says that I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. In other words, the Egyptians are going to look favorably upon the Hebrews. And so it shall come to pass that when you go, you shall not go empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor. And here in the ESV it says everyone shall ask of her neighbor. But the idea here is that they were going to ask for all of these things. In her that sojourneth in her house, jewels of silver, jewels of gold, raiment, and you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters. And you shall, it says here spoil, but it also says plunder in the ESV, the Egyptians. And so what I see happening here is that the Egyptians are still looking favorably on the Hebrews for to an extent. And so the Hebrews are going to go to them and say, look, we're leaving can we have some stuff, some wealth to get out of here? And the Egyptians, number one, are going to be dealing with all these plagues hit them, and that's going to be one motivator. But the other is going to be maybe a little bit of guilt, maybe a little bit of, we're sorry our Pharaoh treated you so badly. And so they're going to give them these things, these jewels, these pieces of wealth for them to have coming up out of Egypt, because they had been slaves for a few decades here. I don't know if I'm exactly right on that, but that's just what I'm reading here, is this idea that the Hebrew people would find favor in the sight of just the Egyptian people. Obviously, they're not going to have favor in the sight of Pharaoh. Pharaoh charges after him, tries to kill him. But the Egyptian people are giving up of their wealth to the Hebrew people as they leave. And we'll see that happen when they actually do leave a few chapters later. All right, so that brings us to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1. And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, Jehovah has not appeared unto thee. So after all this back and forth, God tells Moses these things to say, but Moses has said, I'm going to say all this stuff, and I might say all the right words. They're still not going to believe me. And knowing that Jehovah God has real power and can do real miracles, the Hebrew people would believe if they see a sign. That's what Moses is saying. What can I do to show them that I'm really coming from you? And so Jehovah said unto him, What is that in thine hand? He said, A rod. God's not asking because he doesn't know. God's asking to draw attention to the rod from Moses, or for Moses' sake. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it. And Jehovah said unto Moses, Put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand, and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. That they may believe that Jehovah God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee. And Jehovah said furthermore unto him, Put now thy hand into thy bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. So I can imagine just, they wear these robes and stuff. He's putting his hand, kind of an Abraham Lincoln move here. Puts his hand inside of his robe at his chest, and he draws it out. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. Verse 6. And he said, Put thy hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and he plucked it out of his bosom. And behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. And shall come to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, that they will believe the voice of the latter sign. So God gives him two signs to prove that he is indeed from Jehovah God. The rod turning to the serpent and back again, and then the leper's hand, or the hand turning to leprosy and then back again, showing that God has that kind of power, that kind of control over the things of nature, as the creator God. So, and then it says, verse 9, And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these two signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it upon the dry land, and the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land. And Moses said unto Jehovah, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech, and of a slow tongue. So here Moses is still saying, okay, great, you gave me these three miracles. He's still trying to refuse the call here to be this leader, coming up with every excuse. So he's turned away from, they're not going to believe me because I could just make stuff up, to, well, I'm not a good speaker. I'm not really good at speaking. So that's, and he's, you can hear him running out of excuses at this point. But this is what he settles on. And Jehovah said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Well, that's a kind of an echo of Job, isn't it? Job's going to question God. You can kind of see, not in reality, but maybe a show of frustration from Jehovah with Moses here, the same way that he talked to Job. Who are you to question God? Who are you? Did you not? You weren't there when I made the heavens and the earth. You weren't there when I made the stars, and you weren't there at the beginning when I caused the flood to destroy all of the people, So here God is saying, who has made man's mouth, or who makes the dumb or deaf or the seeing or the blind? Have not I, Jehovah? So God is just saying, you're making an excuse, man. I'm the one that made the mouth. I'm not giving you something that you can't do. And so, verse 12, now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. A little bit of an echo there. We see in the gospel accounts when Jesus sends out the men who became the apostles. He says, don't take thought for what you're going to say. If they take you before the magistrates, and don't practice, God's going to give you right then what you're going to say. So here we see Moses having that same promise. Verse 13, and he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him who thou wilt send. And the anger of Jehovah was kindled against Moses. He's still making excuses. And he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he comes forth to meet thee. When he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. So God just wipes away all of his excuses. And I like that this is shown here, because we today have that same thing for us. We can come up with all of the excuses in the world about why we can't preach the gospel or talk to people about Jesus, or why we can't do this or that in service to God. But that's all they are, is excuses. When God commands us to preach the word, to go out and make disciples of every nation, when God says this is what it is to be a Christian, is to serve me, anything that you say that is supposed to be an excuse about why you can't is just that. It's just an excuse. And put yourself in the place of Moses. God's already swept away all of that for you. He's not giving you something that you can't do. Find it within yourself to step up and do what you're supposed to do. Now, I'm not saying you have to do everything. What I'm saying is that when things come up and the opportunity is there, don't shy away from it. Don't resist God's call of preaching the gospel, because he's given that to everybody. I'm not saying there's a specific call to anybody. I'm saying that God has commanded all of us as Christians to preach the gospel, to be soul winners. And so we can't use our flimsy little lame Moses type excuses to say, well, I can't really do that. I don't talk to people. Well, no. God made our mouths. God is not going to give us something that we can't handle. So anyway, God says, all right, fine, get your brother to do it. I know he can speak well, and he's going to be happy to see you. He's going to come out and meet you. In verse 15 it says, thou shalt speak unto him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. So God's going to be like, take your brother, go do it. I'm going to be with you. Get it done. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. So God's kind of setting up this chain of command. And God says, all right, Aaron's going to be the speaker. He's going to kind of be like your surrogate mouth, and then you're going to be kind of like I am to you, in terms of authority. You're going to tell him what he needs to be saying. And that doesn't mean that Moses is going to be in nature like a deity. It's just going to be in terms of authority, that he would be standing as God would be in his relationship to Moses. Verse 17, and thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. And Moses went and returned to Jethro his father. So he ran out of excuses. He's like, okay, God, I'm going. And Moses went and returned to Jethro his father-in-law, and said unto him, let me go, I pray thee, and return unto my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. So he gets his father-in-law's blessing. And Jehovah said unto Moses in Midian, go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. So Moses, if you understand the timeline here, Moses has spent another 40 years living his life. He's been a shepherd. He's been married to Zipporah. He's got a kid. This isn't a few months that have passed here. This is he's been living life. He had a chance to live as a prince of Egypt. Now he has had a chance to live a full just life of peace. God is calling him now to go back to Egypt and do this thing in the last 40 years of his life. And so all this time that he's been there, Moses is now the guys that tried to kill him, the people that had sought his life for what he had done, they're all dead at this point. And so God says, go on. And Moses took his wife and his sons, so he has 2 sons at this point at least, and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And Jehovah said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. There's a lot of conversation that can be had about that phrase. Moses is going to go and he's going to show these signs. He's going to say, I am from Jehovah God. It is Jehovah God that has sent me to you, Pharaoh, asking that you let God's people go. And then he's going to show them these wonders. And then the phrase, I will harden his heart. But then we talk about, does God directly flip a switch in Pharaoh? And I use Pharaoh a lot when I'm talking to people who don't believe in free will, who argue against free will. Pharaoh made his own choices. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. God saying that I will harden his heart, we have to ask the question, how did God do that? Did God supernaturally reach into Pharaoh and alter his mind in such a way that Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrew people go, bringing all 10 plagues upon his own people? Well, that would make God an unjust tyrant, wouldn't it? If Pharaoh was like, yeah, sure, go ahead. And then all of a sudden he has to say, no, I can't let you go because God changed him, then God is a tyrant and he's unjust and he's unworthy of worship. That is not what happened. We see, and we'll see in this narrative where Pharaoh is shown a sign and he's kind of wishy-washy, but it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. How does God harden Pharaoh's heart? God hardens him the same way that other people are softened, by communication, by showing these signs. You have a prophet of God, essentially, that is coming to Pharaoh and showing him real miracles, real signs. And in seeing those and hearing that he's about to lose his entire slave labor, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. God is presenting information. God is presenting an impetus, but it's Pharaoh that's responsible ultimately for hardening his own heart. We can talk about the gospel. I heard a really good example of this. When you talk about hot water, boiling water, what does boiling water do to an egg? Well, it hardens it. Well, what does boiling water do to pasta? It softens it. Same environment, right? Same exact environment, but 2 different outcomes. And so it's not the environment that ultimately is responsible. It's the inside. It's what's on the inside. And here, Pharaoh was presented with clear evidence that there is a God who has real power, who is asking, these are my people, let them go. You have no right to enslave them. And Pharaoh chooses not to let them go. And so he acts as the egg in the hot water. And so I want to, and I'll point that out as we come along, that yes, it says here that God will harden his heart, but he's not doing it in a supernatural, miraculous way. He's doing it in a communicative way. And so keep that in mind as we continue on. I do not believe that God manipulates men that way, that God takes away or strips away our free will. to make these choices. So, all right, verse 22, and thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith Jehovah, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. Talking about the nation here. So this is a proto-nation, not quite a nation yet, but God is talking about them as a group now. Israel is my son, even my firstborn. So God is identifying, in this context, Israel as his firstborn son as a nation. And it's important because of what he says next. And I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. And so Moses is going to tell Pharaoh, hey, this nation, these people, these slaves that you got enslaved here, these are like a son to my God. And if you're going to keep them enslaved, and if you're not going to let them go, then he is going to find retribution and taking away your firstborn. And that's what Moses is supposed to tell. Well, can you imagine a threat like that? God says, let his firstborn son go, or God's going to take out your firstborn. Well, how is Pharaoh's heart hardened? Hearing those words. That's what hardens Pharaoh's heart. And then in verse 24, and it came to pass by the way in the inn that Jehovah met him and sought to kill him. Who is him? This is Pharaoh's firstborn son. You have God already poised, ready to take the life of Pharaoh's son. He's now from this point on got a kind of a direct watch over, even a presence there with Pharaoh's firstborn son at this point now. Now here's an interesting thing. When we see it in the movies, I know when we see it in the Ten Commandments, I know when we see it in the Prince of Egypt, Pharaoh's son, because of all of the other context that they interpret, is usually presented as a little child, as a young boy. Here, Pharaoh's firstborn son is at the inn. We're talking about a grown man here. This is not a young child that we're talking about. At least not the way that I read it here. So anyway, that's the way that God has Moses presented. Is Israel is my firstborn son. You let him go, or I'm going to take out your firstborn son. And he's got all these signs to know that God can do what he said he would do. All right, and then verse 25. So they get on the road, and Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son, and cast it at his feet, and said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. And so here, Moses has realized God's pretty serious about this whole firstborn son thing, and people who don't listen to him, that's an important thing to God. So Moses makes sure that his children are circumcised. It seems that the whole Midianite thing, they didn't have the sign, or they weren't keeping up with it because Ishmael was circumcised, but they weren't keeping up with the thing because Moses' son wasn't circumcised at this point. And Zipporah, you have Moses has to hold him because he's a grown man, or at least a teenager at this point. Zipporah is the one that performs the circumcision and throws it at his feet and says, surely your bloody husband art thou to me, meaning that this is a bloody tradition that your people have. And so he let him go. That is, Moses let his son go. And then she said, a bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. So she's just commenting, this is your bloody husband. This is a bloody tradition that the Israelites have. And Jehovah said to Aaron, so now the focus shifts to Aaron. Jehovah said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went and met him in the mount of God and kissed him. So Aaron comes out to meet him, and very excited, as God said. Aaron was very excited. One of the things that Prince of Egypt gets wrong, when Moses shows up, Aaron is voiced by Jeff Goldblum. Aaron is not excited to see his brother at all. In fact, Aaron is very skeptical and presented as somebody who's very hesitant. Aaron is the one that's making all of the complaints as kind of the spokesman for the people. But here in the Bible, Aaron is presented as very happy to see his little brother. Remember, his brother was in the reeds. His brother had to be given up because the Egyptians were trying to kill all the firstborn. So Aaron is excited to see his brother. Met him on the Mount of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron all the words of Jehovah who had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And so they go, and Moses is now back in Egypt, and they've gathered all the elders together. And Aaron spoke all the words which Jehovah had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that Jehovah had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. Again, the Prince of Egypt movie, what I see at first is that the people are very hesitant to accept Moses as a leader. They're very hesitant. They reject him. And, how dare you? They're kind of hearkening back to, who's made you a ruler over us? Are you going to do to me what you did to the guy yesterday? They have that kind of attitude. But here in the Bible, they believed these signs that Moses did, and they accepted that Jehovah had come to free them. And they bow their heads in worship. Again, I believe this is a sign that shows that we're still dealing with people who knew of it. At least the older people of this time knew what it was like to live in peace. That this isn't generations upon generations of slavery, that this is a fairly recent thing that their slavery was, because they immediately accept this is Jehovah God who's come. He's heard our cries, and they worshiped God because of him sending Moses. Moses is the second major type that we deal with in the Bible. The first is Adam. The second is Moses. And the third major type of Christ, pointing to Christ, is David as king. So Moses is this deliverer, this savior of the people, in a physical sense. It doesn't save them from their sins, but in a physical sense, Moses delivers them out of bondage and leads them into freedom and makes of them a nation. And that is typifying or pointing to Christ as a great deliverer, delivering his people, the church, out of the bondage of the Jews during the first century, and making of them a free nation. And that's a very important theme. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 10, and it's actually talked about quite a bit in the New Testament. You've got Galatians chapter 4, and I believe Revelation talks about that. But this idea of Moses typifying Christ, he is the second major type pointing to. There's a whole bunch of them, but Adam, Moses, and David are the three major Old Testament figures that typify Christ. Christ is therefore the antitype, the thing that is being pointed to by these examples. So that finishes up Exodus 3 and 4 for us tonight. We will most likely be back tomorrow for the next couple of chapters or so, depending on how long they are. And thank you for joining us. If you have found something edifying in this and would like, please go ahead and share it. And if you have any questions or comments, anything you want to talk about, you can leave comments in the comments below, the section below, or you can privately message me if you want, and I'll happily discuss whatever you want. So again, thank you for joining me, and you all have a wonderful night.